do we want to move on from
Sorry,
this?
something's not right. Wait a few minutes and try setting up again. You can also try unplugging your
I'm gonna fix that issue because my internet just went out for a second there.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Osint Bunker podcast. This week you've got myself, Osinttechnical, and Jordan from Air Intel, who's back with us after a brief time away.
Indeed, I have returned.
And it is great to have you back.
Indeed, it is. And this week we're going to be discussing Afghanistan. We're going to be discussing a lot of the stuff that's going on in the Indo-Pacific, as well as some of the surprise news in the last week or so around AUKUS. But before we go any further, we just want to say, obviously, the plan with Season 2 was that we were going to have a guest speaker on each episode. Unfortunately, this week that has not worked out. Our planned guest had to pull out due to some personal circumstances fairly last minute, and despite our best efforts we weren't able to find someone to replace them on such short notice. So you just have the pleasure of the three of us this week.
Yeah, and sort of, disappointed that I couldn't bring on some individuals to talk about Asia Pacific, but hey, we're good enough, aren't we? Gonna bully the rest of us, aren't you there, John? Are we not good enough for the listeners? No, but more seriously, there not a lot has happened in the past week. But honestly, to be honest, with the whole Asia Pacific situation, it's really only one announcement that's sort of cascaded into this entire sort of series of events, and only things have been only been done on paper, and it's actually somewhat amusing to um see the entire situation sort of play out the way it has. Of course, the underlying events behind why things have played out the way they have are obviously concerning, and definitely tell us sort of or give us an indication of how bad the situation is. But it's obviously things have only happened on paper so far.
Indeed, and I think, to be fair, it's not just that as well. Obviously, with everything in Afghanistan now having kind of wound down to a certain extent, the focus of a lot of the world now is kind of on the next sort of major potential conflict. And I think it's fair to say that China has been very vocal in the last few months, more and more aggressively so, and we've seen a lot more activity from their military, a lot more exercises, a lot more test launches and flights into Taiwanese airspace, for example. So I think it's fair to say that we've been seeing a ramping up in the Indo-Pacific sort of space for a while, but the announcement by the US, Australia, and the United Kingdom in the last week has certainly sort of brought that into focus for everyone else.
Yeah, and definitely, the agreement was more. How do I put this in the best way? The existing Australian deal with France to provide diesel electric submarines was um, not flawed, but more fit the Australian intended political use case of this
Yeah,
non-nuclear solution that was still possible to go
but
very far from home.
just look at if you're looking at like Australia's non-nuclear thing, for example, because they've gone nuclear, they now can't get into New Zealand waters, for example.
Yes, I mean they do operate their subs out of the north of the country, but still, it definitely has caused some chafing, at least, or it will cause chafing once the subs actually go into service.
Mm.
Um, but those subs, they fit a very unique use case, which was this sort of Australia is in this isolated position where any sub activity actually sort of has to happen far from home in order to support the sea lanes that supply Australia. Um, this nuclear deal allows them to operate far longer on station for further away from the country. And the big thing from that is it's less directly controlling and patrolling their sea lanes and more long-term, potentially offensive operations in places like the South China Sea and near Taiwan. And it's this sort of changing of the abilities of the Australian Navy to operate further away from home. And the US and Britain definitely wanted to take advantage of it and sort of change the skill set of the Australian Navy in that case.
But I think like the sub deal is obviously is like because it's sort of the first part of the agreement. It's been seen as it's kind of people are saying the whole agreement is through purely a sub-led the submarine project rather than actually the AUKUS agreement is actually wider technology sharing, like
Mm.
long range strikes, as it was mentioned. As in, this is obviously the first and obviously probably arguably going to be the biggest part of it, but the future potential of the agreement is huge in terms of what they're going to be able to do with with their combined technologies.
Yeah,
Yeah, and of course the Australian material is definitely one of the big assets in the deal as well.
yeah, and like you say, Jordan, it's worth mentioning that it's not just the submarines. Obviously, at the moment, we've seen in recent months decisions by the UK military, for example, regarding purchase of certain platforms, particularly aircraft, have been somewhat influenced by what Australia is operating. For example, we've seen obviously the order for the E7 Wedgetail. Um, all three of the countries that we've mentioned operate the P8 Poseidon, um, and I understand Lockheed is currently looking at an offering of a variation of the UK and Australia's Voyager tankers for the US military in light of the struggles that have been going on with the Pegasus project.
You've also got the wingman, the unmanned wingman system that's on offer that Australia is introducing, and also the UK is eventually going to introduce.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, Boeing Australia has made a lot of progress on unmanned systems and especially unmanned combat systems. And they, of course, have been a bit more open than, of course, some of the U.S. development, but they've definitely made very, very large strides in that front. I think, additionally, though, the Voyager tanker deal was a very unique one, as it sort of indicates the US need to acquire these platforms quicker than was going to happen with something like the KC-46 or whatever future tanker replacement program was going to be. So I believe there's sort of this thinking within the US defense community that there needs to be a quicker acquisition and a quicker procurement process and production process for a lot of these weapon systems and assets, which indicates, and reflects this concern of a, potential conflict in the near future that I think a lot of different defense figures are very concerned about.
Yeah, and the thing with the Voyager as well that's interesting is obviously it was once offered to the US. This was quite a number of years ago when the US was trying to replace the older KC-135E Stratotankers, and it was one of the two competing designs at the time, but was ultimately rejected from that competition. So it's
Yeah, and
interesting.
that was
Yeah, it's interesting to see that the Americans have now kind of turned around and actually said, well, hang on, maybe we should consider it again.
I think it's as time's gone on with the popularity of the A330 MRTT, given the fact the wide adoption by NATO as a multinational fleet tanker has probably influenced that decision.
and additionally, Boeing obviously put pressure on the U.S. government on the lobbying
No
front
doubt.
in order to acquire the KC-46,
Yeah.
and that lobbying could only hide the extreme or cover for the extreme issues of the program for so long before Lockheed believed they had an opening to represent the Voyager program to the U.S. And I'm assuming that Lockheed hasn't done this, just randomly. There obviously was, studies done, and sort of Lockheed understands the political situation and may believe that this is the time that they can actually present and get the aircraft acquired.
Definitely, but I mean, like, it really depends. If this is what they're going to offer, then obviously, if this is offered as a new tanker, then what are other companies going to offer? Are Boeing going to come back with a revised KC-46 or just offer more KC-46s?
Yeah, I think the issue with the KC-46 right now is the speed of production. Obviously, I believe there's sort of the general belief that the Voyager would be able to be acquired and integrated into the US military quicker than something like the KC-46. Though, granted, there are some small changes that probably will be made to whatever final presentation, if it gets accepted. There will probably be changes, but um, I think there's this general belief that Boeing is sort of unable to provide the KC-46 as quickly as it needs to be, acquired.
And it's worth saying as well, the KC-46 hasn't been particularly successful on the export market compared to the Voyager, and that's something they have to bear in mind as well, because as you say, that the production rate would be affected for the US if there were a significant number of exports, but that's not the problem they've got with the KC-46. They haven't got that many
Because it sucks.
so it's yeah. As you say, it is very, very understandable that the US is looking at other options. I mean, they've always operated a mixed fleet of tankers, haven't they? At the minute, we've obviously got KC-135 Stratotankers, they've got the KC-10 extenders, and then obviously the few KC-46 Pegasus
KC-130s as well.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
KC-130s as well. Yeah.
So if the Voyager were to be acquired, the US would be operating what, 5, 6 different tanker
Five or
platform?
six,
Well,
I'd say, yeah.
yeah, include buddy stores on the FA-18, and you're up to 7 different tanker platforms, um, which would be the most, I think, ever, right? Um, no, it would tie for, I believe, the early 80s when the A7 could also do buddy stores as well. But I mean, that just comes down to the I think the idea that the U.S. military needs to diversify its acquisitions because devoting everything to this single tanker replacement obviously caused some fairly large issues. With these single platform issues, like with the odd decision to go for some sort of augmented reality refueling boom operator position, and other issues with cargo carrying capacity and passenger capacity that these issues just snowballed into this massive just I don't know a great way to put it, just this massive pile of problems that severely crippled the ability of the tanker to actually operate and to be integrated into the military.
And it'll be interesting to see as well what effect the Kabul airlift has had on sort of tanker planning and sort of strategic air movement planning in general.
Well, I mean, the KC-135's definitely proved itself. The fact that they used it to facilitate with C-17s going into Afghanistan and coming out again. The KC-135 proved itself with with being a large enough platform to get lots of troops into the country and get them out, and also help transport the refugees back from the various bases back to America as well.
Yeah, and obviously we saw a fairly significant usage of the KC-10 extenders out there as well, for sort of more for the refueling side of things than the actual sort of personnel movement. And obviously, I'm sure, no doubt, there were KC-130s on the ground as well that were carrying out the evacuation alongside the C-17s because of their obviously short takeoff capabilities as well.
Yeah, and that's definitely sort of a platform capacity question of, does the KC-135 have, as much capacity as the KC-10? The KC-10 is sort of aging out of the fleet just because, obviously it's a platform that really you can't keep flying forever. And so it's this problem of, if the KC-46 can't properly replace, the KC-10 or the KC-135, then there's going to be a serious capacity shortage. For a lot of operations. And of course, the Kabul airlift was one where, because of the nature of how the C-17s had to fly in, they immediately had to hook up with the tanker after leaving. Um, and it was just this, question of, we need something with enhanced capacity that can actually um, that can actually compete and can provide this, enhanced tanker a solution. And the main thing is that, I mean, the U.S. Air Force, the U.S. Navy, they all operate off tanking capacity.
Mm.
And the U.S. uses tankers more than any other nation for operations, and so it's sort of this, it's this urgent need that needs to be filled, and obviously sort of cycles back to that question of, if operating against China or operating in some sort of South China Sea, denied situation where you aren't able to use airfields in the Philippines, or even potentially, Japan, where Japanese airfield facilities are also denied, like in Okinawa. The need for tankers grows even larger, and the need for long range tankers as well continues to be a bigger and bigger issue. And as the KC-46 isn't able to fill that role, you're going to see, of course, presentations like the Voyager move in and be more competitive, just because they're able to, gear up and create more tanker capacity as quickly as possible.
Yeah, and that's something that Airbus has gotten fairly good at as well, because it's worth mentioning it's not just Voyager. A lot of the European operators of the Atlas, for example, the A400M Atlas, have been looking at the tanker capabilities of that aircraft.
Well, at the minute, the French have got theirs cleared for helicopter refueling, and I know that for a fact.
Yeah.
And I know the Germans have got theirs refueling, and it was doing trials with the Swedish Gripens this week, I believe the Germans were.
Mm. And that's potentially something that the UK could look into in the future as well.
The UK's ones would have to be purely helicopter refueling, as they could not refuel anything fixed wing with their aircraft with the 400.
Yeah, that would obviously present an issue. But that's definitely a question that they're going to have to take in mind as more countries attempt to acquire the Voyager platform. And I guess we'll see sort of into the near future what type of capacity or production capacity Airbus is able to keep up with, which is certainly going to be an important thing. Um, I think a lot of people have sort of posed the question of, if there is a hot war, and this is, still an if question, not a when,
Mm.
but may become a when question, as tensions continue to raise. Um, the production abilities of the West versus China to produce, to acquire, and then to field advanced systems in some sort of hot war where there's a high rate of attrition. Um, that is a super big question facing Western countries right now, where China is able to gear up production of stuff very quickly. And that's certainly a potential risk in any sort of conflict.
Yeah, and I think it's fair to say that the Chinese transport fleet has been probably one of the most overlooked aspects of their military growth. But it's probably one of the more astonishing sides of things as well. They pretty much have their own version of every Western military transport aircraft at this point, don't they? But they've got their own version of the C-17. They've got their own version of the Atlas. They've got their own tankers and heavy lift helicopters as well at this point.
Yeah, they're mostly based on designs from other nations, but once they continue to increase their own domestic, design and production capabilities, it is a real risk um, to other countries. Unlike a hot conflict with Russia, where pretty much anything you destroy in the Russian arsenal, it's going to be pretty slow to be replaced, if it can even be replaced at all. Versus China, where there's that real risk of them being able to replace wartime losses fairly quickly. Um, and it's one of those hot war issues, which is seemingly a higher and higher risk as time goes on. And of course, again, a reason why AUKUS was created was basically in order to utilize the potential production capability, manpower, and material offered by Australia, which is the closest, not Western ally, but the closest large country in the region that can actually operate with Western countries. And so that's going to be a big thing in the near future as either AUKUS increases in capability or develops deeper links, and Australia is able to acquire and field more weapon systems offered by the US and the UK.
Yeah, and it would be nice to see AUKUS expand beyond just the three countries, and for perhaps a form of the agreement to introduce other countries in the region.
Well, I think AUKUS is perfectly positioned to integrate and work with the Quad, given the fact that already the United States and Australia are members of that.
Yeah.
Yeah, just put India in it already. I know Indian representatives will actually be in DC for a quad, or is it New York? It's in the US for a quad meeting this upcoming week. So we may see some progress on that, especially as China puts more pressure on India, both militarily and economically. We see more tension sort of ratchet up between the two countries, which does leave this big opportunity for the US, the UK, and other countries to sort of swoop in and develop relations. We saw France do that with a meeting with Australia or with Indian representatives this past week. And so we're probably going to see that continue to develop in the future as India becomes this, not dyad per se, but this opposing force to the Chinese influence in the region. And then while I mentioned France there, I think we should probably at this point pivot to the not amusing. I won't say amusing because that would be offensive, but the interesting meltdown by France over the loss of the naval group contract with us, or
I'm
not contract, but agreement with Australia to develop diesel electric long range submarines.
I mean, I get why France are angry, and I mean, like every country would be entitled and perfectly have the right to be angry and upset at losing the deal. But purely from my perspective, I don't think the recalling of the ambassadors is actually helpful to the situation.
No.
Oh, not it's not just that, but they're going after everyone. They're going after Switzerland. They're saying that the UK has become a puppet of the US, which is definitely some 1960s level rhetoric there.
Mm.
It's this entire sort of at this point, look, I've talked with some people, and the seeming conclusion is that this is currently political theater by Macron in order to drive up domestic support in the
Conveniently happens
upcoming
close to
election.
election time.
Yeah,
Yeah.
when his number one potential opposition is a very nationalist figure, and so we're definitely this is most likely a result of that. But even something like that could cause longer term damage, especially because public statements have weight, and can potentially cause diplomatic fractures, and that's certainly a risk.
I think it's fair to
But
say it's not been the whole of, sort of the French politics and sort of companies that have been just outlandish with some of their responses. I think it's fair to say that the most reasonable reaction that I've seen to the loss of the contract actually came from the French firm Naval Group's own Twitter, pretty much the day after the AUKUS announcement. Their sort of response was one of, sadness at losing the contract, but a recognition that that's not the end of the world, and that the agreement and the understanding between France and Australia is still there, and so on. Whereas you've then had politicians and various other figures turning round and effectively almost making it sound like France has been, stabbed in the back, or left on its own in some sort of wild disaster.
yeah, whereas this was, and I believe the naval group acceptance of the situation was the most understanding because they knew what had happened. I mean, they weren't able to present the original conditions of a deal. They had outbid other countries like Japan and Germany over on the initial contract. because they were able to offer, a $50 billion deal with 90%, of the stuff produced domestically in Australia. And then they come back this year with a final deal that, after years of talking with the Australian government, trying to work out an appropriate platform, they come back and offer this $90 billion deal with a non-binding agreement to produce up to 50% of the sub domestically in Australia. And so coming back with an agreement like that definitely hurt Australia, I believe, and caused and sort of drove them to sort of look for these other potential options. And they settled on this fairly extreme one, which was developing a nuclear powered submarine. Um, and sort of that's how bad that second deal was, with Naval Group, was that Australia decided to go nuclear, not weapons propulsion. There's a huge difference.
And I don't know if we want to discuss briefly as well, while we're on the topic of France and Australia and this submarine situation. Um, Obviously, the announcement came somewhat as a surprise to all of us on the evening it was announced, but as much as 24 hours earlier, um, there were indications of it in Australian media. Um, and I think we all kind of took what we were reading to start with a pinch of salt, because it did seem a little bit out there and a little bit of a shock at the time. I don't know if you guys want to comment further on that.
Well, because
I mean, it was pretty much with any deal like that, there's going to be a certain amount of leaking beforehand, and maybe not even leaking so much as, people putting out, bits of information in order to lead the story in the right direction. Because occasionally when you get some sort of deals like that, it's easier to front load it through the press than to actually have the thing announced and have there, just be sort of this nebulous speculation. Because if basically, if the preceding few days the nebulous speculation was potential nuclear deal between Australia, the UK, and the US, it would have been a whole lot worse than the news that came out with, which was nuclear powered submarines versus some nebulous nuclear agreement. And I if I were a betting person, I'd be willing to bet that the information was not officially released, but unofficially leaked.
And throughout the announcement on that night, all three national leaders were very, very, very careful to emphasise that the submarines would be nuclear powered, but not armed with nuclear weapons.
Yes, very, very, very clear about that. Um, which is definitely important and necessary, especially with a deal of that caliber. Though, of course, Chinese tabloids and more reactionary members of the Chinese press, who, of course, pretty much always beat the war drums, definitely did not draw upon that distinction as much as I think the US and Australia and the UK hoped. Russian elections. Hey, let's talk about that for a second, because that's definitely not going to take too long. The polls aren't back, but it's pretty clear who's going to win. It's going to be Putin and his party. Um, there were some pretty clear examples of ballot stuffing we saw, and just general shenanigans related to the election. But it's nothing new, honestly. The last two or three elections in Russia have been fairly clearly shams, and Putin has this wide base of support, but it can never hurt to you know jimmy the results and make sure you have that broad mandate, or at least a perceived broad mandate, to do whatever you want. But we know the result. Putin won.
Yeah, and that's now what he's coming on now for 25 years in office or something like that. I'm trying to remember exactly when he
Well, it
started.
depends whether or not you include that period where he switched over
To being prime minister.
to being prime minister, and Medvedev became president. So whether or not you include that, which he was de facto um, president, while Medvedev was de jure president. So it was this sort of this whole situation. But he changed the constitution, so he doesn't have to do that again. Um, but it's this whole situation of Putin has this very strong power base within Russia, whether or not it's legitimate or illegitimate, that doesn't really matter. He can do whatever he wants to. Um, and that's definitely a big question and a potential. I mean, it's not a concern. It's just a known factor. Putin gets to operate in the way that he wants to.
Hmm.
Period. End of story. There's nothing else to talk about on that. Um, it's just it's this sort of very set, reality of the situation. There's really nothing else that can even be talked about. Oh wait, Afghanistan. I think definitely the first thing to talk about with Afghanistan is definitely obviously the evacuation. The end result was fairly successful. It was chaotic. There was a huge number of people left behind, not just U.S. and Western citizens, but the current situation in Afghanistan has evolved. So the Western powers are now out. The main conduit between um, Afghanistan and the West is Qatar. It's going to remain to be Qatar, and will be into the future. Um, they certainly have an in with the Afghan government, who we saw appointed last week. Um, a very interesting set of individuals, if I don't say so. Um, Definitely the more extreme networks won out. The Haqqani network is the leading faction in the Taliban government right now. Period. End of story. It's very, very clear that they are the ones with the power right now. And the big thing with that is, we're going to see a super conservative Afghan government. And the members who we saw appointed are all very conservative clerics. A number of them are from the previous Afghan government, and a very large portion of them fought in the conflict over the last 20 years. So that's something that those are the parties that we saw won out, and those are the guys who are now, and I say guys because it's, again, an all male cabinet. Um, and those are the guys we definitely saw won out in this, competition, in this power struggle. There were some factions who were the ones who pushed for some hardcore peace at the Qatar negotiations, with some sort of transitory government with the previous Afghan government. Those guys have mostly been pushed to the side. A few still have roles, but they're mostly on the sidelines right now. The ISIS K has definitely put together a resurgence. Basically all over the sort of that central Kabul, Jalalabad sort of corridor. They have a very, very large presence, and they are the reduced pressure by ISAF forces and by Afghan government forces against them has definitely allowed them some wiggle room, and they are having a lot of ease in operating against the Taliban. They've already committed several attacks that have killed a number of civilians, and frankly, I expect them to continue, and I expect them to continue to be effective. It's going to be very hard for the Taliban government to put this insurgency down in any reasonable length of time. Um, and on top of that, it's obviously going to cause some pressure as the Afghan people sort of expected the whole end of the conflict to be the end of the conflict, and as that reality sort of steps, or sort of starts to evolve, that won't happen. We're definitely going to see some pressure by the Afghan people against the Taliban government, though that's probably not going to do anything in the in the entire situation as a whole. But that's pretty much where things stand in Afghanistan right now. Reverting to this very extreme government, you know, different militant groups this time, but the Panjshir resistance has been effectively crushed at this point, and Taliban have very strong control.
Yeah, and I think it's fair to say that the whole US idea that they were still going to be able to help affect the situation in Afghanistan with over the horizon strikes has pretty much gone out the window. Um, Especially after I think the sort of admission this week that the strike that took place near Kabul airport actually probably didn't kill any terrorists. It just ended up killing what was it, 10 civilians, including 7 children.
Um, the numbers are unclear at this
Yeah.
point, so
But it's fair to say that the US has had to hold up its hands and pretty much say, yeah, we mucked up there. Um, and that probably, as you kind of said, is going to be the biggest issue now with the situation in Afghanistan. The fact that the US does not have boots on the ground, whether that be uniformed boots or more so the sort of intelligence sources on the ground, the US cannot really keep as close an eye on what's going on, particularly with ISIS, and obviously Al Qaeda potentially resurging as well. And so it does mean, as we've discussed, in previous episodes, that there is going to be an increase in the risk of terrorism. Um, Perhaps not now so much in Afghanistan itself, but with the group potentially gaining strength and gaining followers outside of Afghanistan.
yeah, and we did see CIA threat assessments that various militant groups are not only interested in moving back into Afghanistan but have done so. And that's definitely a huge risk um, into the near future, and may actually become a physical risk to the West, as these groups sort of find Afghanistan to be a very welcoming base of operations, and a place where they can operate without too much risk. And as we've seen, the U.S. ability for over-the-horizon airstrikes, with the airstriking Kabul that killed an aid worker, yeah, isn't great.
Mm.
Over-the-horizon airstrikes with a very low capability to conduct intelligence operations, it's going to cause issues, and we saw that happen, and it's going to continue to happen into the future. Um, Striking these targets it isn't going to be easy, and definitely will give these groups room to operate inside of Afghanistan. You want to do the news now?
Yeah, I was just thinking we just quickly mention Carrier Strike Group as well, because we're kind of
I will let you handle that.
yeah. So the UK Carrier Strike Group 21 has kind of reached the midway point now in its round the world journey. The ships have obviously stopped off in Japan and some of the surrounding nations, and the crews are, well, to a certain extent, enjoying a little bit of time ashore while the ships undergo maintenance ahead of the return journey to the UK later this year. Um, we've seen the US and British F-35s exercising with the Japanese. They've also engaged with South Korea a few times, and I have to wonder what China and North Korea and some of the other nations in the region are sort of looking at the carrier and what they're thinking about it at the moment. I think it's fair to say China was very openly mocking the carrier strike group originally prior to its travel through the South China Sea and sort of into the Indo-Pacific region. Um, I don't know if you want to really sort of add anything to that. It just
Pranked China. No, but to be more serious on that, China definitely does perceive that as a potential risk. Obviously, the ability for more U.S. and UK combat aircraft to operate close to their shores is definitely perceived by the Chinese, both the public and the government, as this risk to their sovereignty or their ability to project their sovereignty. Um, and they view it as a continuing issue, especially as the UK continues to develop its ability to project that carrier power, with the Prince of Wales as well coming into service very soon.
mm.
Um, and that's definitely something that we're going to continue to see evolve. I think I've said the word evolve too many times this episode, but right, this is a wait and see week, as we've definitely experienced. This is more of a week to look back at the things that have happened in the past and what's happening in the future. And as things continue to evolve, we'll see. We'll see what happens basically, and we'll try to take an assessment of things as they're happening, and sort of the different events and the public reactions, and of course whatever private reactions we can get, which is definitely important.
Yeah, and I think it's worth, while we're on this topic of sort of Japan and the UK carrier strike group as well, just sort of maybe discussing the events of the last 2 weeks, with South Korea's submarine launched ballistic missiles, and then obviously North Korea's train launched ballistic missiles. Because um, I think it's fair to say the South Korean sub launched missiles were perhaps more of a surprise to folks than anticipated. Um, it's been no secret that for a while South Korea has been developing its own sort of ballistic missile design. Um, but I think the test launch the other day kind of took people rather more by surprise than I was expecting, certainly.
I wouldn't even say the train launched one was the big one. The big one was the cruise missile, which basically the nature of a ballistic missile makes it very easy to detect post launch and during its terminal phase. Super easy to detect, to identify, and not to shoot down per se, but definitely easier with the number of anti-ballistic missile systems in the region to lob a large number of interceptors at the few missiles that North Korea has and the even fewer nuclear warheads. The real risk is, of course, that cruise missile, which is a lot harder to identify, and if they're able to produce enough, the potential for swarm attacks can definitely interfere with any potential interception. It's just a lot harder. And the way that they've sort of phrased the announcement of the missile, calling it a strategic weapon, the Western version of strategic pretty much always means nuclear. And if they're using that same terminology, it means they intend to put a nuclear warhead on it, which again just gives it this very large risk case. And it's definitely an asymmetric attack vector that's different than their normal, artillery and their ballistic missile capabilities. It's definitely a change.
Yeah, and I think it's probably a change that perhaps wasn't expected because of all of the sort of negotiations that have been going on. Obviously, sort of in the months and year and a bit since Trump's visit to North Korea, it's fair to say that sort of diplomacy between the North and South has expanded. We've seen active efforts by the South Korean President Moon to try and sort of reach a mutual agreement with Kim Jong Un, and to a certain extent that seems to have had some progress. Obviously, it's done nothing to prevent North Korea continuing to develop new weapons and continuing to expand its ambitions, particularly, as you say, with nuclear weapons. Um, but I think it's interesting that the timing of it all as well, particularly when South Korea's relations with Japan are not necessarily as good as they have been in the past, and then obviously as we've mentioned earlier in this episode, the advent of the AUKUS agreement as well. A part of me suspects that any future expansion of AUKUS will have to sort of weigh up what the diplomatic situation between South Korea and Japan looks like at that stage.
Yeah, the relationship is a weird one, fraught with, 1,000 years of history, and they do have these common enemies, which has driven them closer together in recent years. So, we'll see.
We'll move on to the news stories and wrap it up, I believe.
Gotcha.
So, this evening we have breaking news that a US Navy T-45C Goshawk jet trainer has crashed into a neighborhood in Texas. Although both crew members are alive, they have both been hospitalized, and although the pilot is believed to be in a reasonably good condition, the backseat operator at the moment, the condition is not known. Further information from the US Navy is not yet released. Kazakhstan has become the latest export customer for the Airbus A400M Atlas. In a surprise announcement earlier this week, Kazakhstan announced that they would be purchasing 2 of the aircraft for their air force. Um, I think it's fair to say that other than the countries that were originally involved with the A400 project, Malaysia and now Kazakhstan are the only sort of export customers for the type. Um, it's interesting as well that Kazakhstan has picked the A400, particularly in light of the fact that a lot of Kazakhstan's equipment at the moment is of Russian origin. Whether that indicates anything about Kazakhstan's relations with the West, I don't know. I think it's probably indicates something's going on there, but I wouldn't say it's definitive of anything. Um,
Yeah, and that's definitely something to watch for.
as previously mentioned in the episode as well, obviously we've had this announcement of the AUKUS agreement. For the time being, obviously the submarines are the primary aspect of that agreement, and it remains to be seen whether there's additional projects in the pipeline that haven't been announced yet, or whether that is solely the sort of the basis of the agreement is around this nuclear-powered submarine for Australia. Um, I think it's going to be interesting to see what happens, because obviously Australia was prepared to pay, what was it, $90 billion for 12 diesel-electric submarines designed by the French.
I think the question was whether or not they were ready to pay 50. I don't think they were ready to pay 90.
Yeah, they might not have been prepared to pay 90, but I think it will be interesting to see whether or not they end up with a similar number of nuclear-powered submarines. I very much doubt it. I've heard people suggesting that in light of it being originally 12 diesel-electric subs, we're more likely to see 8 nuclear-powered subs. If
Depends on how
that's
much financial support they get. That's going to be a
Yeah,
huge question.
yeah. And I think if it does end up being 8, that will be quite an interesting little situation, because obviously um, the comparison is always going to be with the UK, and obviously the UK has 7 nuclear-powered attack submarines. Obviously, it does also have 4 nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarines, but in terms of the actual attack submarine role, the UK obviously has 7 in total. If you regard the Trafalgar and Astute class both at the moment, and obviously once all the Trafalgars are gone and the Astutes are fully in service, there will be 7 of the Astute class. Um,
Yes.
Whether the design for the Australian uh, boats ends up being some sort of hybrid between the US Virginia class and the British Astute class remains to be seen. Um,
I still think it's going to look somewhat more like the Los Angeles class.
Yeah, yeah, and that's entirely possible. And as I say, it's going to be very interesting to see in the next 18 months as they sort of thoroughly investigate the idea and potential designs.
And to be honest, I believe there is there is a chance Australia may actually end up acquiring a few Los Angeles classes um, to serve as either trainers or to serve as, early testbed vehicles or testbed craft to begin training that fleet or to begin training that crew because currently they do not have enough crew to even service 8 larger nuclear submarines. They just don't.
Yeah.
And so they definitely need to improve that first.
And I think it's going to be interesting as well to see whether or not this design ends up incorporating some of the sort of design processes that are being used for the Columbia class submarines that the US Navy is developing at the moment, and obviously Britain's astute replacement, the SSNR project design as well, which I think for me the thing I'm wondering is how good a design is this going to be, and potentially are we going to end up seeing a an Australian submarine that is more capable perhaps than the US and British designs that are currently in service. In which case, will the US and will the US and the UK help Australia develop a next generation submarine that they then potentially also end up building themselves at a later date? Who knows? As I say, the next 18 months in particular are going to be important certainly in laying out the design for this new submarine class, and we'll see what happens. China has obviously been very, very vocal about its concerns with that. I think it's fair to say we haven't really heard much from other countries in the region. Taiwan, Singapore, Indonesia, none of them have really said anything. New Zealand has obviously been vocal about the fact that it doesn't want nuclear-powered submarines in its waters. Whether they are able to hold on to that demand in the long term, I very much doubt they will. I suspect that if the situation, particularly with China, continues to evolve in the direction that it has been heading, I suspect New Zealand may well have to back off a little bit on that sort of opinion on things, but we shall have to wait and see. And that is going to be the news for the week. So, thank you very much everyone for listening. Our next episode may be a week or so later than planned, but we are hopefully going to be aiming for an episode roughly every 2 or 3 weeks now, moving forward, particularly as we head into late 2021. Obviously, if the world catches fire, as it seems to do fairly frequently, we'll obviously put in an episode where we can to cover the news stories as they happen. But thank you very much for listening. If you don't already, go follow the Bunker's Twitter account at the Osint Bunker. Go catch us on YouTube if you fancy watching us live on YouTube, or alternatively you can download the podcast from rss.com/the Osint Bunker, and you can obviously listen to us on Spotify, Apple, Audible, Amazon Music, and other platforms as well.